Hi everyone, I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the Paper 1 exam that you're all taking on Monday afternoon. You've had this slide that's shown up here in your Easter booklet now from the final push evening, but it's just a quick reminder of what's coming up in the exam and the pages that you can find it on in your CGP guide and the case studies that fit in with each section. So I'm just going to go through some of the stuff that's going to come up. I'm going to go over some of the questions that maybe are a bit trickier, recap quickly the case studies for you in case you haven't spent much time revising those, so you've got some facts to take away. So here you can see, this is again in the Easter booklet, everything that you need to know for section A. I would just ask you now to pause that briefly and just sort of red, amber, green in your head where you're at with those different topics. Any of these could come up. It's more likely that the shorter answer questions are going to be more sort of atmospheric or climate change based, and the 8 marker is looking like it's more likely to be a tectonics based one, which obviously we've learnt Haiti and Japan for. So just pause the video now, and in your head, if any of those sections are still red, you've got the page numbers there that they are found on your green CGP guide. So for each of the sections, I thought I would just quickly go over some of the trickier questions. So these questions, if you've already taken the sheets from the hub, which are all the questions that could come up because they've never come up before, you'll recognise some of these. I just wanted to go over these really briefly because I think these are some of the hardest ones in there, and actually the wording of them is quite tricky, but the actual geography in them is quite straightforward. These will also be in our afternoon lunchtime session where we're doing revision in the hall, so please do come along to that where all the geography teachers will be there. So if you've still got any questions on any of these or you're really not sure about them, just ask us in that session. So the first one there, ocean currents, nothing's come up before on that in the past, so I definitely would revise that. This is the idea that the sea is more heated at the equator and that warm water moves away from the equator towards the poles. Everywhere that it goes to, basically, it's bringing warmer, wetter conditions with it. And then it goes away to the poles, it gets colder as it moves away to the poles, and then the cold water circulates back towards the equator. And if a place is affected by a cold ocean current, because it runs alongside its coast, it's going to have colder weather, potentially drier weather as well, because there's not much moisture with it. The second one, past climate change. Just remember that past climate change, it's referring to physical causes of climate change. So that's your sunspot theory, orbital theory, and eruption theory. They could also ask you about asteroids. It's unlikely, but asteroids is the same. If an asteroid from outer space hit the Earth, lots of ash would go in the atmosphere. That would block the sun, and that would cause the temperature to decrease. Both a volcanic eruption at that scale or an asteroid could lead to long-term changes in climate, just like the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. Number 3, the enhanced greenhouse effect. The key word to remember here is enhanced. If you see that word, it means the human activities that increase the greenhouse effect. So we want to see you talking about human activities here, increasing the blanket of gases, that traps more heat, less can escape, so the temperature warms. Formation of a tropical cyclone is asking you how it is formed. So you're going to start with your 26.5 degrees Celsius seas. Those are near the equator, so about 5 to 30 degrees north or south of the equator. They travel across the sea, picking up moisture from the sea as all that evaporation is happening. The spin of the Earth causes winds that cause the cyclone to spin in an anti-clockwise motion. And as it moves towards land, it picks up more energy from warm oceans. We then know they die out when they're over land or when they move over colder seas. The next one, storm surge defences. So this is basically talking about a sea wall, because a storm surge is a big wave that comes with a tropical storm, and so you just treat it like a sea wall. How does it help prepare people? Well, hopefully it traps some of that water from the storm surge, so then it protects houses and properties behind it. The hotspot one we've done quite a lot in class. Just remember that hotspots form in the middle of a piece of crust, a tectonic plate, sorry, of the crust, and it's a magma plume from the mantle, forces its way through the crust. As the crust continues to move, it forms an island arc or a series of volcanoes. How can earthquakes be predicted? You need to know a couple of ideas for this one. They're very hard to predict, but you need to know seismometers can predict it. You can also use measuring radon gas, which is gases that come out just as an earthquake's about to occur, but they're not very reliable. And shallow focus, basically that's the point of shaking underneath the surface. So if it's very shallow, that means it's close to the surface. It's going to spread out over a further distance. It's going to lead to more shaking at the surface. It's going to lead to a bigger tsunami. If it was a deeper focus, then all that energy would be absorbed into the crust, and so there'd be less shaking. So that's just a few that might be quite tricky for you guys. Case study wise, it's pretty certain, I'd say 95% certain, 98% certain, the 8 marker is going to be on tectonic hazards. So it will say for an earthquake or a volcano, or it will say for a tectonic event you've studied. And your case studies for those are Haiti and Japan. I just wanted to cover those as they're most likely to come up. Please do have a quick look at Hurricane Katrina and also Cyclone Nargis as well, though. Those are both in your Green Revision Guide. So things to remember, the Japan one, it's a developed country, but some of the key problems that they had with that were the following. So 16,000 people died. That was mainly because of the tsunami. Cost a lot of money to repair because those buildings are worth more. This is what it measured on the Richter scale. They were prepared. The ways that they were prepared were the bullet trains, earthquake-proof buildings, earthquake drills in schools. Everyone knew this was coming. They just didn't predict how high the tsunami was going to be. And you can see in the photo there, the tsunami just went straight over that seawall. Although they did have one, it wasn't high enough. The ways they were unprepared were that it wasn't high enough, and also the Fukushima reactor failed. It's not really a way they were unprepared, but it was one of the biggest failings of this disaster and the subsequent issues that followed. However, they responded extremely well and very fast. So they were really well prepared in the first place, which meant there was less damage because people were evacuated to safe spaces, many of them. The earthquake-proof buildings themselves, many of those weren't damaged, so that was a brilliant saving as well. And in terms of the people that were hurt or were trapped, 100,000 Japanese soldiers were brought in really, really quickly to help rescue people. The best doctors and nurses were flown in from across Japan to aid people that were hit worst. And emergency housing was put up in for evacuees from Fukushima. It had clean drinking water, sanitation, they had electricity in them. They also very rapidly raised the height of the wall to 10 metres in the hope that in future these events won't be quite as severe. And Haiti is obviously your contrasting case study, so this is your developing country case study. Japan, you would say overall, was pretty well prepared, although there was a significant cost and damage cost to it. That's mainly because those buildings were worth so much money. Whereas Haiti, in a developing country, they were not well prepared at all. The responses were really not that great either, and so this country really struggled. So we're going to have a look at some of these facts now. 220,000 people died. That wasn't from primary causes necessarily. Many of those people died from cholera because they didn't get clean drinking water in time to be able to save their lives. And in addition, where 8 hospitals collapsed, that would be the primary effect. As a result of that, many people couldn't get healthcare that they needed, so they died of injuries and things like that as well, or being trapped in buildings. It measured a lot less on the Richter scale, and it hit in the year 2010. They were mostly unprepared. There weren't really planning laws in the city, so you could build houses however you wanted, so they weren't safe. And when they collapsed, people were not really knowing what to do, how to rescue people. People themselves didn't know where to evacuate to, there were no warnings, and even if there had have been, many people lived below the poverty line on less than $2 a day. There was also a really corrupt government who haven't spent much money on infrastructure and preparing people and safe buildings, and so overall this was an absolute disaster on a mega scale. The responses also weren't great, so aid took over 24 hours to arrive. The United Nations set up food for 2 million people. You could use that as a positive, an international organisation that's supported, but it was slow. £100 million in aid was sent, but it didn't reach the people who needed it most. People tried to build their houses using rubber tyres and things that they could, but again, it wasn't very safe. And one of the biggest facts for me that actually I still find really quite upsetting is that in Haiti we're now 13 years on and the damage still exists from that event in 2010. So overall the Haiti case study is a case study of disaster. where it wasn't well managed, they weren't prepared, and still now they're rebuilding. So the next one that we've got here is development dynamics. This is section B. Have a quick look now again, pause this video and check your red, amber, green against those things that you need to know. If there's any you don't know, it tells you there the page to look at on the CGP guide. Okay, so once you've done that, we've got some exam questions here that are slightly trickier. Again, these are going to be in the PM session, the lunchtime session in the hall, so please come along to that or practice some of these at home. So some of the questions that are slightly more challenging, that haven't come up before: why might countries have a high fertility rate? Fertility rate is amount of babies per woman. And in developing countries, that's for two key reasons: lack of contraception or lack of access to contraception, and also people still wanting to have more children to be able to help work at the farm or send them out to work so they can make more money for the families. Also, many people have more babies because they know that children are probably going to die young if they don't have great healthcare, so it's so that more survive. Education can affect the development of a country because as people are more educated, they can work in the tertiary sector or higher sector paid jobs, and this increases the overall GDP of the country. People pay more taxes, and that helps develop the country overall. The third one, a disadvantage of using intergovernmental organisations to promote development. So this is the idea of getting some big groups to come in and help with building a dam, for example. The biggest issue with this is that they often lend countries money, and that then has to be paid back in loans with interest. So it leaves lots of countries in an economic difficulty, and it can be quite challenging for them to ever pay the money back. Governments have contributed to globalisation through policies created, such as free trade agreements, where they've allowed companies to come and set up in their countries. And this then increases the amount of jobs available because they might have TNCs that then locate there, and they give jobs to people, which helps to increase globalisation further, that connectedness around the world. How has globalisation benefited some countries more than others? So in some countries, it's led to more free trade agreements, like I've just said before, more FDI from TNCs. So those TNCs go into those countries, it makes jobs for those people. But you could also say in some countries, globalisation hasn't benefited those countries because often those TNCs go in and the profits go back to the TNC, like Shell in Nigeria. So the countries themselves don't benefit so much. You could also talk about those TNCs creating environmental damage and that being a negative. Top-down strategies could benefit a country. For example, a dam being built, or it creates HEP. This helps the country to secure a renewable energy source and also secure reliable drinking water. For a named developing country or emerging country, so when you get this one in section B, this is going to be India. Describe the changes on imports and exports. This one's really nice and easy in India. So in 1990, they were mainly exporting primary goods like tea and coffee and importing manufactured goods. And now in 2015, they're predominantly, that means mostly, exporting manufactured goods like machinery, and instead they are importing raw materials which are much cheaper, like the basics of oil and things like that. So they used to get not very much money for their exports. Now they're getting lots of money for their exports and not paying so much for what they have to import. So it's had a complete change. Explain the impacts of economic development, a variety of scales. So for this one, you could talk about the fact that India's getting richer. It is helping people who are, you could talk about the scales in terms of age. So for children, this is mainly beneficial because there's now better education, so their education levels are improving and so they're able to get better paid jobs. You could talk about how it doesn't help the elderly because often they're left behind in rural areas and there's a lack of investment into those aspects. You could talk about local businesses in India, how they may not benefit from economic development because actually most of the jobs and companies coming in are TNCs, so they are growing at a much quicker rate than maybe localised businesses are instead. For a named emerging country, explain how its relationship with the EU and USA has changed. Again, a really nice, easy one with India. India is one of the largest trading partners with the EU. The EU is a trade bloc, the European Union, so that is an amazing beneficial thing for the EU, but also for India. It means they've got a really big client base, basically, of people who want to trade with them. And the relationship with the USA, you could say trade again. India does trade with the USA. You could also say that India is now part of G20, and that is the 20 most economically developed countries in the world, one of them being the USA, and that's helped develop that relationship too with a known superpower of the world. So facts to remember for India, I'm just going to fly through these quickly. Independence since 1947 from British colonialism, and as we talked about before, they've got an increasing economy. It is worth knowing how significant that is there. In terms of the 0.3 trillion to 2.1 trillion in 2015. That is a very, very rapid economic growth. That has mainly come from a change in the exporting of goods, which I talked about before. So they're now exporting higher value goods, so they're earning more money from it, basically. Their GDP's higher. They've got great trade. Their situation really helps. So you can see on that map, they've got the coastline on three of their main borders. They're also very close to the Suez Canal to be able to transport goods into Europe. Part of G20, so they've got political influence at a global scale. Positive impacts of development, quite nice straightforward ones really. So as it's developed, life expectancy's increased, education levels have increased. We do need to be aware that most of that benefit has been in the area of Maharashtra, which is the area in the west of India, on the west coastline. And the city of Mumbai, for example, is in Maharashtra. However, when we think about negative impacts of development, there's massive pollution from TNCs that have come over and invested. The rural areas such as Bihar, which is in the north, have been kind of left behind. They're not getting all the development of hospitals and schools, and the elderly have been left there whilst the sort of middle-aged have moved to the cities and they send back money. It's called remittances to their family. So they're kind of left behind and areas aren't improving. You could also say the TNCs, they take a lot of money out of India and they keep that profit. So the last section is the Urbanizing World section. I'm just going to ask you again to pause this video, red, amber, green in your head or on a bit of paper, those key topic areas and the page numbers in your CGP guide. These questions, again, most likely to come up, but also the most challenging. They're going to be in the afternoon, in our lunchtime session. We're going to go through them very quickly. So why urban areas have a greater influence than others? It's a really good question. So it could be to do with their location. So if they are maybe coastal, then they might have a greater influence because they're better in terms of trading partners, etc. It might also be dependent on the actual use of the city, for example. You could have said, you know, if they've had a large amount of investment from TNCs, then they're going to grow faster than other urban areas. Lagos is a great example. You don't need to talk about that within the question, but Lagos isn't the capital of Nigeria, but Lagos is more and greater influence than Abuja because of the fact that it's on the coastline, it's got greater trade, it's got more TNCs in it, it's got most transnational corporations in it compared to anywhere else in Nigeria. So therefore it's more influential. You could talk about primate cities in there if you wanted to as well. 2, economic change leading to the decline of urban areas in developed countries. So economic change can lead to deindustrialization, which is where factories close down, which means that that industry can then be sent to other countries. So if you think about in London, for example, used to have heavy manufacturing. That then was cheaper to put in other countries like India, for example, or China. And so that led to a decline in urban areas because those people didn't have jobs and then can move out of the city back to rural areas to find work. 1 or 2 causes of suburbanization. So suburbanization is when people move from the city centre to the edge of the city. They no longer want to live in the inner city. It's too polluted. They can't live in the CBD because it's high-rise flats and things that are far too expensive. So you could say they move there because of better transport. This means people can live in the suburbs and still commute to work. And your second point could be, second cause is the desire to live in somewhere with more open space or a bigger property. So families move to the suburbs for better quality of life. The next one, developing countries have less people working in tertiary. This is mainly due to the fact that in developing countries, people are less affluent, so they're less disposable income, and therefore there isn't such a high demand for those tertiary services. You could, for a second point, also say lower levels of education, so less services are available. Availability of land can affect land use. Again, that's another really good question. So availability is how much have you got? And so you could answer this saying land availability is usually highest on the edge of the city. We'd call that the rural-urban fringe. That gets you a mark, which results in more space available, suiting larger buildings. That gets you a second mark. And this means new developers locate here, for example, large shopping centres. Big shops like Tesco, for example, they're going to locate on land that is cheaper and available because it's more green space and easier to build on as well. For a name megacity, so when you get this one, it's going to be Lagos. If you get into that exam and you're in a panic, you can write about any megacity that you want, as long as it doesn't specify in an emerging country. Obviously, if you were going to talk about London, that's in a developed country. So Lagos ones, for a name megacity, the significance of global connectivity. So this one is considering how globally the city itself is connected. And if we think about Lagos itself, it has an international airport. That means that TNCs can easily set up in this country. It is situated on an Atlantic coast border, so this again means that it's globally connected in terms of trading partners. That's as simple as it needs to be. For the next one, natural increase. Natural increase just basically means people having babies and that exceeding the amount of people that are dying. So how rates of natural increase have led to population growth? You can just simply say working age people move into the city for work. When they're there, they choose to have family, and so natural increase causes the population to grow in urban areas. For a name megacity, explain how population growth has influenced its spatial growth. Great question for Lagos, because Lagos has over 2,000 people arriving every single day into the city. And in terms of its spatial growth, you can say that it means that the city has been expanding outwards and they've actually now reclaimed land from the sea to build eco-Atlantic, but that's going to be mainly available for people who have a higher level of income. The second way it's influenced its spatial growth is people who cannot afford to live in those inner city parts are living in informal housing in areas such as Makoko, which is built on Lagos Lagoon. The last one, explain the political challenges of managing problems within the city. So with this one, it's a bit of a difficult one really, thinking about Lagos itself. Political challenges can just be the fact that the people who are living in Makoko, they're taking up lots of space that could be used for something else. So you could say one political challenge is that governments want to move on people from Makoko so that this land can be developed. This causes a challenge because then where are they going to move those people to? Well, lots of people would be left homeless in the city. You could say another issue that's political is corruption across Nigeria. So this means that government laws such as traffic calming don't always succeed because there's a lot of corruption in Lagos between the wealthy elites who kind of have their own way. So it's the idea that maybe they won't follow the rules specifically when it comes to sort of trying to sort out traffic and congestion. So I've nearly finished this now, just some last quick tips about Lagos. It's the biggest city in Africa, financial hub of Africa. The main thing is it's got an Atlantic border. It's really easy for them to be able to trade across the Atlantic, and the population of over 21 million. So it's most definitely a mega city. 80% of the whole country's industry is located in Lagos. There's high rates of international and national migration. Many people move from rural areas to here because of those high-paid jobs, and surrounding countries, which you can see on that map, also move to Lagos because of conflict in their countries as well. Lagos is deemed as a hive of activity with jobs available, and it's deemed as relatively safer compared to some of those regions that they've moved from. You need to know a bit about the land use, so I would get you to revise the names of these parts of the city. They gained independence from the British in the 1960s, and discovery of oil led to quite an economic boom. You might remember Shell in Nigeria from our Year 9 lessons. There's been lots of inward investment into Lagos. Changes in land use. So the city's been growing. Like I said before, they've reclaimed land for Eco-Atlantic. People have built their own homes because they can't afford to build in the city. So Makoko is a great example of informal housing. Lagos does provide opportunities for people, higher paid jobs. The jobs are 4 times the pay of living in the rural. Lots of people have left rural Nigeria because of mechanisation. Better access to schools and healthcare, mainly if you can afford it. The challenges mainly fall on the people who are poor. The congestion in the city is the worst in the world. There's only one main road, which you can see on the bottom map, the red road there, through Lagos, and that leads to impacts on businesses as well. This means there's high pollution. Big problems include water. Only 40% of the city, 40% has clean water, and 60% of the work in Lagos is informal. So that means those people don't have contracts, they're not paying taxes. That is a political issue. The government are not happy with that. They want people paying tax into the government so they then can spend it on improving some of those problems. The things they have tried to do, they've got the Lagos Light Railway. That's great at reducing congestion, but it's quite expensive, so not everyone can afford it. They've also tried to improve the water supply and waste disposal, but the problem with that is actually being able to access the areas of Lagos to clean them up because of that major congestion. And things that have been done, bottom-up strategies. You've got Makoko Floating School. That's great because it's actually using intermediate technology, stuff that's available. The biggest problem is there's only one school, and that's not enough for the community of Makoko. And you could also talk about the Yoando Foundation for Schools, which is a charity who have gone into Lagos to repair schools, improve them, improve the education that's offered, but they don't build new ones. That's the biggest downfall. So I hope those tips have been useful. Okay, and the last things that I wanted to go through is some top tips for the 8 markers. You've seen these before, so I'm just going to put them all up on the screen for you in terms of structuring. We are going to practice doing some model answers again in our lunchtime session. But whatever happens, do not leave those 8 markers blank. Even if you just bullet point some facts and say this means that, you're going to probably pick up yourself 2 or 3 marks. And remember, overall in this paper, if you want to get a grade 5, you need to realistically get 48%. So we're trying to get half marks at least on every question to try and target that grade 5. Okay, and again, the final tips that we had last time, but we will remind you right before you go into the exam, attempt every question, just write something down. If it's got a graph or a map and it says describe the trend, pattern distribution, trend evidence anomaly, remember your structure in your writing. It is so important. If it says describe, just tell me the things, bullet point it. Don't even need full sentences. If it says explain, we need the this means that as a result. Don't faff about writing in full sentences when it's knowledge. I've just said that already. So just tell me the answer. Get to the point quickly. Revise your facts before you go to sleep. So the case studies, make sure they stick in your brain so they go into your subconscious. If you're worried about the 8 markers, you can always do them first, and we'll see you next week. Good luck.